Okay, so this time we are now starting our live stream. Okay. Okay. So for our first, ano na yan ha? Hindi na yun module 1, module 1 yan na. Module 2 lang na ilagay ko. So the concepts of language, language learning and language acquisition. So we will be differentiating the difference between language learning and language acquisition for this module. So first, let's take note of the following terms. So we have language and the term learning. So when we talk of language, so it means we use to convey ideas from one mind to another. So whenever we would like to say something to others, something to people, we are always using language. And by the way, when we talk of language, it does not always necessarily mean that we're pertaining to the words that we speak. So when we talk of language, it could be in a form of nonverbal cues. Just like, for example, your gesture, the movement of your hand, the way your eyes move, and even the sound that you hear, the food that you taste, the scent that you smell. So those are different forms of language. So we should not box ourselves that when we talk of language, we're only pertaining to spoken word. So hindi lang sila yun. So let's say the letters that you will be sending to someone, the email that you will be sending, the text messages, those things that you're posting in Facebook. So those can be a form of a language. So again, it does not solely pertaining to the word that we are speaking. And when we talk of learning, so let's take note of what Brown said. So learning is getting of knowledge of a subject or skill by study, experience, or instruction. So let's take note of the words study, experience, and instruction. Sabi nga nila, di ba, that experience is the best teacher. So what we experience can be in a form of a learning. So your learning, kaya may tayong tinatawag na learning experience. Okay? And apparently, when we talk of study instruction, so based on what you had studied, it could be on your own, it could be studying with someone else while someone is teaching you. So we are learning on that aspect. Okay, that's according to Brown. Okay, according to Slavin, learning is a change in an individual caused by experience. So Brown and Slavin has somehow similarity on their concept of what learning is. Okay, then next, let's focus on language learning. Okay, so again, when we talk of language learning, we are pertaining to the language that was taught. Okay, the language that was taught. So let's say, for example, someone taught you on how to speak English. Let's say your teacher taught you how to speak English during your elementary years. Now, up to now, someone taught you to speak English. Then on that matter alone, that example alone, is an implication that language is really learned. Okay? And language learning involves retention of information or skill. So when we talk of retention, it is something that is stored in your memory and something that is organized. That's something that organizes your cognition. So let's say, for instance, when you are studying another language, this is my example a while ago, we often memorize the translation of the basic greetings of a certain foreign language. So let's say, when you would like to remember that bonjour in French is hello, you memorize it. So when you would like to remember the English translation of how are you, then you memorize it. So when you keep on memorizing those words that you would like to study, then that involves language learning already. Kasi nga, di ba sinasabi natin kanina doon sa definition ni Brown that learning is something that is being studied. So since when you're studying, you are into memorizing and then you're organizing your cognitive thoughts, therefore, language learning involves retention of information or skill. So that's the first component of language learning. Then, language learning involves active, conscious focus on and acting upon events outside or inside the organism. So when we talk of outside or inside the organism, although medyo may pagka-scientific lang yung paggamit ng term ng organism, but when we talk of organism here, it is pertaining to an individual, to a person. So let's say, for instance, a student learns on how to speak English because it was taught in school. So, since merong nagtuturo sa kanya sa eskwelahan kung paano magsalita ng English, therefore, that is already an implication that language learning involves active, conscious focus in acting upon events outside or inside the organism. Okay? So that's the second component of language learning. Okay? Yung isa, yung una is yung something that you memorized for retention purpose. Pangalawa, something that is taught in school, or let's say may inatinakang could be a seminar, you attended a seminar or trainings about language on how to speak a specific language, then language learning involves outside the person. Okay. Language learning is relatively permanent but subject to forgetting. Maraming ganyan, di ba? So, although we have this tendency, sabi nga natin kanina dun sa una, di ba, that language should be, when we are studying language, it should be retained. It's part of memorizing and how to speak language is also an example or implication of language learning. But it is also understood that there are some instances wherein, although we are studying on how to speak specific language, we have this tendency to forget it. Okay, so even when I used to study Spanish, but this time I already forgot some words on how to construct sentences, on how to conjugate words. I already forgot because one of the problems is that we are not using it. So kahit nga tayo, di ba, kahit sa inyo, although you keep on using, you keep on studying on how to speak English, dumarating at dumarating pa rin talaga sa punto na nakakalimutan nyo yung tamang subject-verb agreement, yung tamang grammar. Although it has been taught to you since you were in elementary, pero nakakalimutan nyo yung basic principles of grammar. Why? The reason is that you are not practicing it. You are not using it every day. Siguro kung kayo yung family niyo, when you are inside the house, most of the members of your family are using English language, then more likely you will be able to practice it. So, kasi ang nangyayari right after it was taught inside the classroom, wala nang practice. You're no longer using it. Then balik ka na naman doon sa nakasanayan mong language. You will going back to the first language. Okay? So, that is what we meant by language learning is relatively permanent. Yung pag-aaral ng language, permanent yan. Pero yung pinag-aralan nating language has this tendency to be forgotten. Okay? Then next, language learning involves some form of practice, perhaps to enforce practice. Ito yung na-mention natin kanina na if you really wanted to have a mastery of a specific language that you would like to learn, let's say you would like to learn how to speak Hangul or Korean language or Thai language or Spanish or Mandarin, but you are not practicing it, you have this tendency that wala nang retention, di ba? So relative to the previous implications which I discussed a while ago, an individual need to practice on using the language he or she is learning in order to remember it, or else master of speaking the language will not be attained. So kahit makabisado mo pa yung mga phrases na yan, ako nakabisado ko yung mga iba't ibang phrases na yung when I used to study French and in Spanish before, but since I'm not practicing it, nakakalimutan talaga natin. So practice, sabi nga nila, practice makes perfect. Okay? But nobody's perfect. So why practice? Oops, like that. Okay, then another point that we have to take into when we talk of language learning is a change in behavior. So for example, a student who is used to speak his or native language in school will adapt the use of using other language if the medium of instruction being used in teaching them is other language. Okay? So, malaking aspekto talaga yung mga nakakasalamuha ng isang learners when it comes to learning the language. So, it will change the behavior. Ano ba yung nababagong behavior dito? The behavior that we are pertaining here is the habit of using the language. So, if you are surrounded by people who are studying English language and then practicing the English language, then you will be affected by it. So you will be influenced by them. So that is what we meant by language learning is a change in behavior. Change in the behavior in such a way that your habit of using the language that you would like to learn becomes more apparent to you as you expose yourself with the same circle. Okay, so kailangan mo ng circle of friends na may interest din sa pag-aaral ng language na yon in order for you to have a change in behavior or a change of habit of using a particular language. So malaki talagang factor yung mga taong nakapaligid sa inyo. And then, so that's language learning. So if we're just going to encapsulate what language learning is, there should be someone who will be intervening to you to learn or to adapt a specific language. Let's say, for example, your teacher is teaching you on how to speak English. Your friends is telling you that it's this how to speak this particular language. So that's what we meant by language learning. There should be an intervention from someone who has this intention to teach you on how to use that specific language. And it involves retention, it involves practice, it involves remembering of the words that you use. So those are the important things that we have to take into account when you would like to study the language. If you would like to learn that specific language. So if you will not be able to practice it, although you memorize it, pero hindi mo naman ginagamit every day, again, there's always a tendency that, sabi nga natin no kanina, that you might be forgetting on how to use that language. Okay? Yan. So siguro ngayon, kabisado mo, but later on, nakakalimutan mo because of the absence of practice. So ano naman kayo yung pinagkaiba ng language learning sa language acquisition? Okay? So let's see. So language acquisition is the process by which language develops in humans. Ibig sabihin, natural na na-develop sa tao. Kumbaga, natural na na-absorb ng tao yung language na natututunan niya. So according kay Brown, he explained that language acquisition can be observed on how individuals naturally adapted the language being used in the environment where they are exposed to. So with them knowing, individuals are not aware that they are actually learning, let's say, monosyllabic utterances to the use of complex nuance and context-specific structures. So kumbaga, di ba when you were a kid, hindi naman kayo tinuruan ng magulang nyo kung paano magsalita ng Tagalog. Or if you are a native speaker of Ilocano, Bicolano, or Bisaya, no one taught you on how to speak those specific dialects. Hindi ka nila sinasabihin na sabihin mo itong salitang ito. But you naturally learn those specific language. So if it is natural for human being to have this innate knowledge of the language they have spoken, siguro paglabas pa at paglabas pa lang ng bata, di ba? Alam na nila. Pero halimbawa, kung ikaw ay Amerikano, nanay at tatay mo Amerikano, at pinanganak ka sa Pilipinas, pero ang nanay mo na pure-blooded American ay Tagalog po magsalita sa iyo kapag kinakausap ka. Ano sa tingin mo yung language na ma-absorb mo? Yung English or yung Filipino? So, the language that you will be acquiring is Filipino. Kahit pa sabihin ng pure-blooded American ka. Why? Because the people around you are using it. You naturally adapted the language without someone telling you na ito dapat ang salitain mo. By just merely listening to others, you will be able to absorb na ito pala yung paano pala sabihin ito. Okay? So, di ba, pag pinag-aralan at binalikan ulit natin yung language development, ay yung human gross development na discussion natin in relation to language development, doon makikita natin yung sinasabi natin, di ba, na yung mga bata during their sensory motor stage, they are adapting what they are observing. If they are observing that you are using this particular word every day, lagi at yun at lagi ang naririnig nila, then there's always a tendency for the child to absorb it. At yun din yung gagamitin nila habang paglaki nila. So sabi nga, how your parents raise you will be who you are. It's the same thing with what your parents use in their everyday conversation, the language that your parents use in their everyday conversation. That is also the same thing with na ma-acquire mo sa sarili mo. Okay? So, next. That is according to Brown. Okay? Then next. Ito. For instance, some children learn to produce sounds like mama and papa because these were the words that were repeatedly said to them by their parents. Di ba when you were a child, sinasabi nila mama, papa. Okay, so ikaw, let's say you're just 1 year old or you're 2 years old, then you keep on hearing those words mama, papa, because those were the words that were keep on telling you by your parents. So therefore, if that was repeatedly said to you by your parents, then you will be adopting it. Then later on, na-obserbahan nyo kahit sa mga kapatid nyo, they're uttering the words, mama, papa. So the child naturally remember these words because of recursions. So when we talk about recursions, it is the recurrence of hearing the sounds. So kaya yung bata kapag halimbawa lumaki sa isang pamilya na ang tone of the voice is sigawan and sigawan, so there's a tendency for a child na maging ganun din siya paglaki niya. Okay? So, the same thing din sa kapag ang parents ay palamura, pagiging palamura din yung bata. Dahil yun yung lagi na papakinggan. Okay? So, kung ang bata naman ay naliligiran ng mga tao na careful sa kanilang sinasabi, ganun din yung magiging attribution nito doon sa bata. So, kasi nga, when we talk of language acquisition, it is naturally adapted. Natural na na-absorb ng bata kung ano man yung napapakinggan nila. So, more so, language acquisition can be observed on the following. So, meron tayong kinatawag na first language, second language, and then foreign language. So, for sure, you have already encountered L1, L2, tsaka L3. So, for first language, it is, kumbaga yung tawag natin in our educational system nowadays is the mother tongue. So that mother tongue is our first language. So if you are a Bicolano, then your first language could be Bicolano or dialect mo yun, Bicolano. But since there is a concern with the groupings of words dito sa Pilipinas, groupings of language in the Philippines, although you're speaking Bisaya, you're speaking Tagalog, you're speaking Bicolano, if you're going to group, then di ba ang tawag natin doon ay Filipino language. So, ang L1 natin lahat, regardless kung tayo ay Bicolano, Bisaya, or Chabacano, may ating sinasabi, ang first language natin is Filipino. Okay? And then, second language natin, obviously sa Philippines, is English. Okay? Second language natin ay English. Ang third language natin, o tawagin natin ay foreign language. So aside from Filipino in English, other languages other than those two are what we call the foreign language. So when you are now studying Nihongo, you're studying Korean language, or you're studying Mandarin, French, and Spanish, those are foreign language. But it's a case-to-case basis depending on the country. Let's say, for example, in Korea, okay, in Korea, their first language is, of course, the Korean language. First language nila yon. And then, I don't know if they have the so-called second language in their country, but English for them is not treated as second language. It is treated as foreign language. That is why we have the so-called foreign language teachers. Okay, meron tayong tinatawag na ESL teachers naman, ng English as second language teachers. So, yung mga FL teachers na nagtuturo ng English, kasi tinitreat doon sa Korea, let's say sa Japan, I think sa Japan and Korea, and even in China, so they are treating English as their third language or as a foreign language. Kaya meron tayong tinatawag na English as foreign language, yung EFL, English as foreign language. Sa atin naman, sa Philippines, English as second language. Okay? So it's a case-to-case basis depending on the country. Maliwanag ba? So if we are going to, again, if we're going to base it in our country, ang L1 natin is Filipino, ang second language natin ay English. So other than these two languages are what we call the foreign language. Let's say in Japan, Korea, and China, their first language, of course, is their own language. Then they're not particular with the second language. Instead, their foreign language is considered, English for them is considered as foreign language. It's unlike in our case here in the Philippines. Okay? So, the next, according to Krashen, so Krashen is, ito yung talagang kilala when it comes to studying the second language acquisition. So Krashen is still alive. Yan, buhay na buhay pa. Alive and kicking pa si Stephen Krashen. So when we talk of language acquisition and language learning, it is always Stephen Krashen who is considered as the most influential. So he hypothesized that the process of learning a second language is distinguished from acquisition, with the latter being a subconscious process of gradual development of ability through use in natural communicative situations with other speakers. So there are some instances wherein we just naturally learn how to use our second language because of the people around us. So let's say, for example, in the Philippines, since we're considering English as our second language, many of us is just naturally adopting the use of language. While unlike in other countries, they need to study English in order for them to really learn the specific, that said language. Pero in our case in the Philippines, there are some instances wherein Filipinos naturally learn. Okay, so halimbawa na nga lang, di ba, ngayon ang mga bata ang gagaling mag-Ingles. Although yung parents nila hindi naman talaga spoken in dollar, hindi naman sasalita ng English sa bahay, pero ang gagaling nilang magsalita ng English. Why? It's because of the technology. So since these children are exposed to, let's say, YouTube, they're fond of watching English English movies, or they're fond of watching ng mga palabas sa YouTube na mga English. So they are naturally acquiring it without someone teaching them on how to use that specific language. So doon pa lang, kasi sinabi ni Stephen Krashen dito na the process of learning a second language is distinguished from acquisition. If we're just going to attribute that in the case of the children at present, their exposure to the technology is something that would really justify the claim of Krashen that second language is really distinguished from acquisition. And these children are not conscious about it. They are not conscious about it. They are now naturally adopting it. Kasi, di ba, mga bata mo 4 or 5 years or 6 years old pa lang, you can hear them speaking English na, di ba? Sometimes mas magaling pa talaga sa atin magsalita yung mga bata. But if you're going to ask the parents, they are not, some of them are not actually teaching their children how to use it. Pero when you ask them, saan nila natutunan yun? It's because nga, they're watching it. Let's say, it's mga palabas sa YouTube. Okay? Then, I think that's it for the lecture for today. So if you're just going to sum it up, the difference between language learning and language acquisition. Sa learning, meron talagang nagtuturo sa inyo. Let's say teacher na nagtuturo sa inyo, nag-attended seminar, something like that. Pero sa language acquisition, walang nagtuturo sa iyo. So someone will be just you will be just affected by others, by the people around you. So kaya malaking factor yung environment na ginagalawa ng isang bata. So kung isang environment ay ginagalawa ng isang bata ay bibigay sa kanya, let's say, ng mga natuturo sa kanya ng nakakarinig siya ng mga masasamang salita, then ma-acquire ng bata yon. Kasi children are very observant. Okay? So, okay, so that ends my discussion. But before I end my discussion, meron akong